Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our kind of conclusion of the Watchers development series. We're going to probably mention these guys later on as well, but in this, now we're going to take a look at how the Watcher story actually pops back up in rabbinic literature later. And so just to recap, we've looked at its, not exactly its beginnings, but it's the first written evidence we have of it in the book of Enoch, right? Where it's already, you can see different traditions going on about these angels that came to earth and caused humankind to sin, right? And then how it becomes this explanation for ongoing sin, this kind of these demonic forces for ongoing sin, whether they are kind of chaotic outside of the regular divine order, or whether, as Jubilees would like to put it, inside a kind of divine order with a kind of a Satan character that rules them. And then we went to the Dead Sea Scrolls, where on the one hand, in prayers, they are portrayed as bastard spirits that fight the laws of God within me and make me want to sin. And you really feel the speaker's struggle, how painful this is, and he's calling on God for help. At the same time, we have the introduction to Damascus, the Damascus document as a rule book. And that says, hey, guys, the only thing important to know about the Watchers is that they sinned. Here are angels that sinned because of their essentially sinful inclination. So how much more do humans have to take care and make sure they do not follow their own will, but rather follow the commandments of God? And with that, we're going to take a giant leap forward and look at rabbinic literature and see where we see hints of this story in rabbinic literature, given how wide and tumultuous the sea of rabbinic literature is. We don't have that many places, but we do have certain areas, and we'll talk about each one of them in turn. Before I begin, any questions? Okay, great. I am going to hop right in. Oh, is there a question?
I do. Could you talk a little bit more just about what we did last week? And
I
about
just did the recap.
Okay. I know I did. I heard that, but I just wanted you to give me the highlights again. Give us the highlights.
Okay,
again.
So the highlights of last week, we looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what's nice about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that it gives us a little glimpse. Of course, it's all written material, so we're not really seeing lived experience, but it's the closest thing we're going to get to lived experience from this period, where we see kind of a wide range of texts of how Jews are dealing with these ideas. Now, admittedly, the Qumran community is a very unusual group of Jews, and let's not forget that. They do not represent all of the Jews as a whole. In fact, probably, and not the majority of Jews either. Probably the majority of Jews are just busy kind of living their lives, trying to do what, the basics, right? And not spending too much time thinking about these materials. But the Qumran community is one of the learned communities, not the only one of the learned communities, in this case around Judea, but of course they also existed in the Galilee, who are learning and reading and thinking about these things. So in the Dead Sea community, and we discussed last week how there are what we call sectarian and non-sectarian texts among the Dead Sea Scrolls. We looked more specifically at the sectarian texts. And we know that, in other words, the Dead Sea sect is copying books that were written outside the community, like Enoch, like Jubilees, and like the books of the Torah, right? And the books of Tanakh. So they're copying all of those, reading them, learning them, considering them very seriously. At the same time, they're also composing some of their own texts, and we looked at those. So we looked at their prayer texts that were calling on God's help for, among other things, to fight against these demonic bastard spirits within them that are within their flesh, fighting with the laws of God, right? So here's this idea of these demonic spirits as being kind of a chaotic force for evil that are inside me, fighting with the laws of God that in a metaphysical way fights it. And this idea, again, is doesn't go against free will. They don't believe that a demon can simply take one over and make one do things. There is maybe one exception in one passage in the Damascus document, which we'll look at in a later class. But in general, you don't see in Second Temple Jewish literature, you don't see this idea that demons can just take you over and make you do things. You can say, oh, why do I want to do this bad thing? It must be some kind of demonic influence. So we see this in the prayers. At the same time, we see in the introduction to the Damascus document, when it's talking about the history of sin, what seems to be, and what I interpret as a conscious effort to distance this as an explanation of sin, where it mentions the watchers not as causing sin, but as simply the first sinners. They are, or the first important sinners, the first guys that we look up and they're like, these were supposed to be stand-up guys. These were creatures of valor, and yet they fell. If even the angels fell by following their own will, how much more so human beings? We need to know not to follow our will, but rather the laws of God. And that's the introduction of the Damascus document. With that, we now fast forward hundreds of years into rabbinic literature.
One more question.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence at all of the influence of the sectarian literature of Qumran anywhere outside the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, the Damascus document, of course, was found in medieval copies. So, right. So that, and then the big question is, was this simply, were the scrolls found and copied over in medieval times because here are ancient scrolls found in Hebrew in Judea, they must be holy and important, we will copy them? Or had these gone somehow underground and been transmitted, right? So that is an open question. We do have an account of in medieval times of scrolls being found in a cave, and in fact, in one account, I believe the patriarchate calls the local Jews over and says, "Hey, we found some of your stuff, right? This is yours," and they take it. And what happens to those scrolls, we don't know, but it would actually make sense for them to copy them. Again, here are ancient Hebrew scrolls that are found in Judea, and anyone who's looked at Qumran scrolls knows that many of them are quite legible, are fairly easy to read if you are used to regular Hebrew script. So it would make sense for them to copy over a document that they found in that way. So that is a clear example. However, the Damascus document doesn't go into the Watcher story. And what we're seeing in terms of the Watcher story, the question is, okay, so how does it kind of come back in? And in fact, in somewhat different accounts than what we've been reading. But let's go in and let's start with the Talmud and Rashi on the Talmud, and then we're going to go and look at some of the Midrashim from the medieval period.
Yeah.
Could you just remind me, why is it called the Damascus document?
Oh, because it talks about them going to Damascus. It uses kind of this, it's a biblical reference, but it talks about them going to Damascus, and that's why it's called the Damascus document.
Final question, is there any evidence of rabbinic exposure to the Damascus document or anything like it?
Not that I know of. I have not heard or seen anything like that. And if anyone has discovered it, it must have been since you spent all my time studying this, because it would have been part of what you studied when you studied the Damascus document, if there had been some clear influence in rabbinic literature. And again, any evidence of the Watcher story is not going to be from the Damascus document, because the Damascus document doesn't talk about, as we said, doesn't talk about the Watcher story as some kind of source of sin, or even in depth. It kind of just refers to it a little, not quite, a little obliquely, right? So let's dive in. Go into my screen here. Okay. Okay, so let's start with Yoma. All right, here we're kind of going right into the middle of a section of Yoma that is talking about where does the name Azazel come from? Azazel, of course, being the designation of the goat that is thrown off a cliff, or simply taken into the wilderness in the Yom Kippur ceremony. And the question is, where is his name from? Where is its name from? So here, after different explanations, we have Tana Devei Rabbi Yishmael, Azazel, Shemechaper, Amaset, Uza, V'Azael. The school of Rabbi Yishmael taught Azael is called because it atones for the actions of Uzzah and Azael. Now, this addition is based on Rashi. Let's actually go right into Rashi here. All right, so this, all it says in the Talmud is just this. The school of Rabbi Yishmael taught Azael is called because of because it atones for the actions of Uzzah and Azael, not explaining any more. Okay, let's go into Rashi, how Rashi explains it. Rashi explains it here. Uzzah v'Azael, and I will translate this. Uzzah v'Azael, malachei Chabala shiardu le'el haaretz b'mei Naama achot Tuval Kayin, v'aleihem ne'emar, v'yiru b'nei Elohim et b'not ha'adam, klomar al ha'arayot mechaper. Okay, what is he explaining here? I'm going to explain it in sections here. Angels of destruction that came down to earth in the time of Naama, the sister of Tuval Kayin, and about them is said, and it was when the Bnei Elohim saw the daughters of man. In other words, the Azazel goat atones for illicit relations. That's Rashi's conclusion. In other words, if we go back to Yoma, Azazel is called because it atones for the actions of Uzzah and Azael. Uzzah and Azael are in fact the Bnei Elohim, the sons of God, who sinned with the daughters of man. And what that means for Rashi is that Azazel atones for illicit relations, because it doesn't make any sense for it to atone for something primordial like that. It has to atone for a current sin, but what they did is illicit relations, and so that's what it atones for, and that's why it's called Azazel. All right. So why would Rashi specify in the time of the sister of Tuval, Naama, the sister of Tuval Kayin? One assumes hinting at the ensuing flood, right? Because this is a generation. Tzila has Tuval Kayin, and the sister of Tuval Kayin was Naama, and then Lemech makes his declaration that he, if Kain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. Some connect this to the number of years to the flood. This also connects it back to the sin of Cain, and so this whole thing, this putting it in this generation, kind of connects it between the sin of Cain and the flood. Okay. Also notice that it's before the birth of Seth, which is important because then it says that Seth is kind of out of this sin, and it connects it to the idea that who are the daughters that they mated with? The daughters of Cain. Who are the women they mated with? The daughters of Cain, thereby thus making that any wrong kind of result of this are not in the Seth line, which is the correct line, right? So the Seth line is where Noach comes from, and Shem, of course, comes from. And so you want to be in that line. And if you say, well, the angels came down in the time of Tuval Kayin, then it also kind of says whatever children they had were not involved with the line of Seth. Okay. Moving right along. So I want to say something about the time of the Talmud versus Rashi, and kind of how we learn Talmud. So in general, when we learn Talmud, we frequently take Rashi, even academically. Rashi is frequently taken to say, this is what Talmud means, okay? Of course, when we look at the Gemara is, let's say, starting from, let's say, 500 CE and on, whereas Rashi, his years are 1040 to 1105. CE, we're now in the Common Era, right? We're beyond the place where we have to count backwards. We're not in BCE anymore. We're Common Era, regular years. So we're talking Babylonian Talmud 500 to 600s, etc. Rashi is 1040 to 1105. So many hundreds of years in between. And so on the one hand, whereas the Babylonian Talmud absolutely shows that there is some kind of tradition of Uzzah and Azael, one assumes this is reflecting what we remember, that Asael is one of the angels in the original Watcher story, that he comes and teaches forbidden knowledge. So one assumes that in fact it is referring in some way to this sin. what are the details, right? So for Rashi, it's clear that it's the illicit women and that there are two angels and these are the angels. We can look, however, at the Midrashic kind of background and see that there is that floating around the time of Rashi, you absolutely have these explanations specifically of these two angels who kind of mess up. So let's take a look at that. I am once more sharing my screen. Go. Okay. All right. So here's the Psikta Rabbati. I actually do have a translation downloaded. So on the right, you see the Hebrew. On the left, you see the English. So we're talking about it's the Psikta Rabbati is, let me give you the year. It's approximately 9th century, so quite late, but before Rashi. Okay. Here we have it's explaining a verse in, close this. It's explaining a verse in Tzefania, that verse being this one, Tzefania Gimel Chet, Zephaniah 3:8, right? Lachen shakuli Nu'um Hashem liyom kumi le'ad, right? I don't think that people in general would have read it as rise as an accuser. They would have said, I rise forever. Therefore, wait for me, says God, for the day I will arise. Ki mishpati lesof goyim lekovtzi mamlachot l'shpoch alehem za'ami kol charon api. This is, I am going to put my judgment on the nations. I'm going to pour my anger on them. Ki be'esh kinati te'achel kol haaretz, because with the fire of my anger or vengeance or zealousness, all of the earth will be consumed. Here we have, so in Psikta Rabbati, here, we read another interpretation of this verse. Davar acher, liyom kumi la'ad, biyom kumi leha'id b'mashiach, sheshkula zchuto keneged pamalia shali. This is the day, on the day that I myself will rise up to be a witness for the Messiah, whose merit is equal to that of the heavenly retinue. Remember, we're now in the Middle Ages, or in the early-ish Middle Ages, where everyone agrees that there's a Messiah, right? And that's a very important feature of the Messianic age. I, God, am going to witness that there is a Messiah. He says, all these attributes before me, and will you not wait for me? Omrim lefanav, if the Jews, Israel says before him, Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe, lev even natata lanu, you gave us a heart of stone, v'hu hit'ah otanu, and it misled us. Uma uza v'azael, here it says Aza and Azael, because there's no vav there. I still like to read the Uza and Azael, but you could say, right, I guess it should be Aza and Azael, because Azazel is clearly the connection here. Uma Aza v'Azael, shegufan esh, sheyardu la'aretz chatu, anu lo kol sheken. And the isn't Aza and Azael, whose bodies are fired, they sinned when they came down to earth. Wouldn't we, of flesh and blood, sin just the same? So what is this saying? This is saying that what is the story of Uzzah and Azael, or Asa and Azael? The story is it's two angels that went down and sinned. One assumes, again, that this is the connection. It's connected to Genesis 6, to Breshit Vav. They sinned with human women. If they sinned, who were so pure, wouldn't we sin just the same? Okay, so very vague. All right, we don't have much detail here. So let's keep looking and find more detail in other midrashim.
Miriam,
Yes.
could you explain a little bit who wrote Psikta Rabbati?
I don't think we ever really know who wrote it. And that's always the problem. And in fact, there's sometimes arguments about what school produced a certain midrash. It's a little bit easier when we talk about halachic midrashim as opposed to a Gadic midrashim, because a halachic midrash is going to continue a certain school of thought. But in general, what we're looking at here are all what we call agadic. An agadic meaning an agadic midrash is telling a story, right? So we can date them a lot of times in terms of what quotes them, what's reflecting them. That's how we can date them. Who mentions them, right? We're going to look at Dvarim Rabbah. It's one of what we call the Rabbahs, right? Now, the Midrash Rabbah, the Rabbahs are all from different dates. They happen to be collected in a collection, but they are not from the same date at all. In fact, Shemot Rabbah, Breshit Rabbah is considered relatively early. Shemot Rabbah is considered relatively late for a Midrash, to the extent that many think that Rashi did not even have access to it, that it postdates Rashi. So if we talk about all these midrashim, it's a little bit iffy. I mean, you do have certain midrashim, and honestly, I can look into it. I don't know offhand. So, for example, the Midrash Tanchuma has a lot of parallels. Yanai, who's a poet in Byzantine Israel, he'll have things that are essentially, they read like a quote of Midrash Tanchuma, right? So even though you might say, well, Midrash Tanchuma seems a little bit late, it seems to predate Yanai, or at least its sources do, right? So there are certain things where you can date things that way, say, okay, there seems to be a land of Israel source here. And in general, the Midrashim seem to be more connected to Israel sources rather than Babylonian sources, but not necessarily. I don't have right in front of me where around Sikta Rabati is considered coming from, but as we get later, it gets harder to kind of distinguish.
So one more time, there's no mention of Uzzah and Azael anywhere in the Mikra, in the Tanakh.
No. We just have Azazel. We have Azazel. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So what's the earliest mention of Uzzah and Azael?
Well, we have Asael again. We have Asael in Enoch, right? Yeah. And there are other places.
Asael in the Mikra, the earliest mention is in the context of King David. So
right, it's not. So it's there are, and I don't remember offhand. I'm fairly certain there's a Second Temple reference which is clearly drawing from the name Azazel. In other words, it's clearly doing, looking at the name Azazel and saying, okay, these have to be the angels, or these have to be angels that are involved. So we do see that those versions of the name rather than Asael. It could be actually in the Ethiopic version we see that more. But I have to look again. But there are in Second Temple literature, you kind of see this desire to connect it to Azazel. Right. But you don't see this very clear. These were the two angels, because if you read Enoch, Shemichaza is and we'll see Shemichaza come up later, by the way, here in the rabbinic literature as well. But Shemichaza is a big instigator in the Enochic tradition. So we'll take a look. So let's go back. But again, for rabbinic literature, the important thing is understanding what the word Azazel means and what it's referring to. And after that, kind of using these angels almost as an explanation of why it's not so bad that humans sin. I mean, if angels can't do it, then what are you expecting from humans, right? So it becomes a very different purpose of using the story, almost the opposite than what we saw in the Second Temple period. Where in the Second Temple period, they're like, hey, frequently it's like, hey, because of this, humans have to deal with these demonic presences, or because of this, we're like, hey, humans, to be extra careful because look at these angels. And it becomes in rabbinic literature much more of a, well, look, God, angels couldn't do it. Maybe you should appreciate us a little bit more. Like we're trying really hard, right? And it becomes, it gets a little bit flipped, where it's a way that angels also don't measure up, right? So let's take a look. Let's take a look at some of these examples.
Miriam?
Yes.
Are you saying Asael and Azael are the same name? Just like
I think, look, it's a little bit hard because they aren't the same name, right? But it certainly later on, it kind of morphs, and it certainly works better as a version of Azael, right? But it does kind of morphs into Azael later. Okay. All right, let's go into Dvarim Rabbah. Here I don't have a translation for you, but let's just read the Hebrew and I will translate as we go. It's a very cute little story. God's like, he says to Moshe's neshama, he says to his soul, he's like, okay, it's been 120 years, time to come out. She's like, really? Really? And she says, Amra lefanav. She said before him, Ribono shel olam, master of the universe, master of the world. Yodat ani shata Eloha kol haruchot v'kol nefashot. I know you're the God of all the spirits and all the souls. Nefesh hachayim v'metim misurim b'yadecha. The life and death are in your hands. V'taburatani v'tayatzatani v'tanitatani b'gufo shel Moshe 120 shana. You created me, you formed me, and you put me in Moshe's body for 120 years. V'akshav Yesh guf tahar ba'olam yoter migufo shel Moshe. Is there any body more pure rather, than Moshe's body? Shalom avos ruach srucha me'olam. It never had a kind of a stinking spirit. It never had any kind of sinful thought. V'lo rimav and no worm. V'lachen ani ohevet oto. That's why I love him. Ve'ni rotzeh letzid mimenu. I don't want to come out of him. Amar la kadosh baruch hu neshama. God says to her soul, neshama, tzii, al-tachri, come out, don't be late. And I will lift you to the highest heavens. And I will put you under my throne of glory. Among all these angels. She said to master of the universe, she's not an idiot. She knows that even in heaven, they're not like Moshe. And she says, Uza from your glory and above came down two angels, Uza and Uzael. V'chamdu bnot aratzot. And they wanted women, daughters of the world, and they perverted their paths on the land. Until you suspended them between earth and heaven. About Ben Amram, about the son of Amram, Moshe, miyom shenigleta alav basneh lo bali ishto. From the day that you appeared to him in the sneh, in the burning bush, he did not have relations with his wife. So you can tempt me by saying I'm going to sit under the chair at the throne of glory with all these angels. I know those angels are not as good as Moshe. Don't try and trick me, right? And the example she gives are Uza and Azael, these two angels that went down and they mated with women. And their punishment was that they were suspended between earth and heaven. Very much like in Enoch, not just very much, but clearly parallel to what happens to the giants' souls, the giants' kind of half angelic souls once they die in Enoch and Jubilees, right? That they're kind of suspended, they're spirits that are connected to the earth. So she's kind of hinting to that, they become these kind of wayward spirits. So she knows that, angels have nothing on Moshe. Okay, so notice again how we are changing the purpose of this story to be angels are not that great. You know what? It's a hard thing not doing illicit stuff, specifically sexual transgressions. It's a hard job, and angels aren't up to it either, right? That's kind of what becomes the moral in the rabbinic version of the story. Okay, now let's take a look at Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Yes.
Remind me again. When is that thing in Dvarim Rabbah? When is it dated to roughly?
So Dvarim Rabbah. Let me take a look. I don't like to say dates without it in front of me. So hold on just a moment. Dvarim Rabbah is dated between 450 and 800 CE, which is a pretty wide gap, but around there, 450 to 800 CE. So like if you're talking about, so again, if we're talking about what's the background of Rashi saying, oh, hey, this is talking about the angels who mated with human women, and knowing that that's the answer, there are already these Midrashim that are saying, hey, there's Uza and Azael, or Uzzah and Uzziel, and they are these two angels that mated with human women, right? Again, still drawing from Azazel, right? Still drawing from the name Azazel.
But it's clearly it's a Christian-like ethos that celebrates celibacy as the essence of purity.
Well, it's specifically, and I do think it works within, especially medieval rabbinic kind of thought, where there is this tremendous temptation to elicit sexual relations. And that is one of the big sinful inclinations. And so one of the hardest things to fight is that. And because of that, this story is being used to say, hey, even angels fall from this, right? So God cut us some slack, right? Angels think there's another version like angels, they think it's easy. And then they actually come up against it. And it's like, hey, they also fell. So it becomes this idea, not that it's okay to fall, right? But that it's something very difficult. And that even angels don't have anything over humans when it comes to this sort of thing. Okay, and the fact is that Moshe is considered almost superhuman in this. He's like not considered a normal person. And that's kind of the point. Like she's saying Moshe, and that also is the point here where she's like, the soul is like, Moshe is like, you're not going to get any better than Moshe. Look at how amazing he is. This isn't normal. This isn't regular, right? This isn't the regular thing to do. So
to quote Rabbi Archie Bunker, angels don't have private parts.
Yeah, so that's the thing is here it's saying, and if they did, they'd be sinning all the time, right? That's kind of the point of these stories. Like if they had to contend with what humans have to contend with, they would not be able to stand for it. When they do have to contend with it, they can't stand firm, even though they think they're so great. Right? Because again, it's a different attitude towards angels. In the Second Temple period, angels are amazing. Like okay, you've got these sinning angels, but the other angels are fantastic. And part of the reason why these sinning angels are punished so badly is because more is expected of them. And there's this idea that angels are really worthy of almost worship, like they almost worship, right? You're not allowed to worship angels, but you want to pray among them, you want to rise to the level of angels, etc. Once you get to the rabbinic period, it's much more of, we were given these commandments and angels weren't. Why weren't they? Well, because it's somehow they're not as good as we are. In some way, angels are not as good as humans because humans got the Torah and they did not. And they wanted the Torah. And God's like, hey, you don't have the human things that are necessary in order to fulfill the Torah or in order for this to be meaningful at all, right? Moshe says it to them also. So that it becomes part of that narrative, the narrative where humans are better than angels. That's why we have the Torah, right? We have a different job, which in the final analysis is a better job because we have the Torah, right? So that becomes kind of a different emphasis. Let's continue on. I see people aren't buying this. I'm not sure where the gap is. Why the doubt? I mean, this is what it's saying. We'll see more of it. We'll see more of it. Okay, we have not finished yet. Okay. All right, here we go. Okay, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Now, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer is interesting because Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which dates, which dates to the 9th century, more or less. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer is known for its reflection of pseudepigraphic stories. It seems to know different stories like from Enoch and other unusual works, and they're reflected in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. And this is kind of a known phenomenon. So this is not going to surprise us to find it here, given what we know about Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Of course, this is part of it, right? Okay. Rabbi Omer, Ra'u hamalachim shenaflu mimakom tushatan min hashamayim et benot Cain halchot gluyot basar erva. Now, this is a different way of using the story. Here, this story is part of the sinning of Cain and the following generations, saying that his line is perverse, right? So here it says, I'm just going to read the English. The generations of Cain went about stark naked, men and women, just like the beasts, and they defiled themselves with all kinds of immorality, etc., etc. Right? And essentially, they're going to be blamed for the flood, right? And that's why the angels get so tempted. The angels fell, and they see Bnot Cain, the daughters of Cain, Mahachot gluyot basar erva umekachlot enehen kizonot, right? They not only are they completely naked, they also shade their eyes like harlots. V'ta'u acharehen v'yiku mehen nashim shenemar ve'u b'nei Elohim et bnot adam, right? And they stray after them and they take wives from among them. Okay. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha Omer, right? So Rabbi Yoshua has to explain something here. Hamalachim esh lohatim. The angels are flaming fire, as it says, his servants are flaming fire in the Psalms. Right? But so the fire, so the question is, what didn't this fire when mating with flesh, didn't it burn the body? No, when they fell, they took on the appearance and the bodies essentially of humans, right? So they wore clods of dust, like they wore a human body. Okay. Shenemar lavash b'sari rima v'gush afar. My flesh is clothed with worms and clouds of dust. From Eob, it's just a to say that it was like that, right? Rabbi Tzadok Omer, mehem noldu hanakim hamalchim begova koma mishalchim yadam b'chol gezel v'chamas u'shfichut damim. Dichtiv v'sham ra'inu et hanefilim v'gomer v'omer hanefilim hayu ba'aretz. So Rabbi Tzadok says, from them were born the giants, Anakim, who walked with, I'm not sure, it could be pride in their heart, or just means they walked tall. They were really tall, right? And they stretched forth their hand for all kinds of robbery and violence and bloodshed, as it said. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, which were in Bamidbar. Remember, that's how we know that the Nephilim and the giants are connected, because in the original verse in Genesis, there is no mention of giants, right? And in Genesis, it says, and Nephilim were on earth in those days. So here we have, I'm gonna skip over this because this is well, actually, no, let's read this. I'll just read it in English. Rabbi Yoshua said, the Israelites are called sons of God, as it is said, you are the sons of the Lord your God. The angels are called sons of God, as it is said, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. And while they were still in their holy place in heaven, these were called sons of God, as it is said. And also after that, when the sons of God, Bnei Elohim, came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became the mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And it doesn't actually go that far. Just Shenemar v'gam achrechen asher yavo bnei Elohim. In other words, why are they called sons of God if they sinned? And the answer is because when they were still in heaven, they're called bnei Elohim. Okay. Rabbi Levi Omer, even though it seems that they're called that afterwards also, which is a little weird. Rabbi Levi Omer, Hayu molidim et bneihem upiryan v'rivyan kimin sheretz gadol shisha mikol davlei das. They had many children, like a reptile, right? 6 children at a birth, right? And there was something kind of wrong, right? From the beginning, they have children, they have 6 at a time, like a snake or like a reptile. And as soon as they were born, so it says that as soon as they were born, they stood up, they could speak Hebrew, and they would dance. Okay. And then Noah tries to kind of make them repent, and they don't quite get it. So what do? It says when they came to their wives, they said to, behold, we will restrain ourselves from multiplying and increasing so as not to produce the offspring of the children of men. In other words, Noach says to them, repent, and he has an effect. What did they do? When they came to their wives, they spilled the issue of their seed upon the earth so as not to produce offspring of the children of men. As it is said, and God saw the earth, and behold, it was spilled. Let's take a look at that, actually. Cute. Okay. Vihine nishchata is that God saw the earth and it was defiled, it was perverted, is what it means, right? But there it's connected to lehashchit et hazera, to destroy the seed, in that spilling it on the ground. In other words, to ejaculate on the ground is lashchit also. So this is God's like looking at the ground and he sees that it's full of ejaculate, and this is not going to go well for them. Okay. They said, if he bring from heaven the waters, the flood upon us, behold, we are of high stature, the giants say, and maybe the angels also, and the waters will not reach up to our necks. And if he brings the waters of the depths against us, behold, the soles of our feet can close up all the depths. What did they do? They put forth the soles of their feet and closed up all the depths. What did in other words, the tohomot, right? The deep wells of water, right? So like if God rains water on us, so we'll just stretch out our necks. If God tries to bring up water from these tohomot, from the well springs, we'll just plug them with our feet. Okay, so what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do? He heated the waters of the deep, and they arose and burned their flesh and peeled off their skin from them. Okay. So, and then we're at the flood, right? So it just leads kind of directly to the flood. And we have this kind of very weird little story where these angels, and if we go on, the only it's interesting here that they don't specifically connect Og to the angels. It mentions that Og, king of Bashan, survived as the only remaining giant. We have that's a reflection of what's written about Og in the Torah, right? That Og, right, for only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the giants, explains how he survived the flood, but everyone else is killed. Okay. So what we have here is a kind of a weird depiction of the story, where the main one of the main differences seems to be how connected it is to the Cain story. In other words, what it does is it's kind of bridging that Cain's descendants are immoral. That's who the angels mate with. The angels themselves so don't get it that they follow up one sin with another, right? They took human women, they have all these children. Noach says, look, repent, God's going to bring a flood. And they're like, no problem. We will simply spill our seed on the ground, which is also not allowed. So they're just following, sin with sin, and the result is a flood. So a kind of an unusual story, but probably the most extensive one that we have in rabbinic literature. And again, in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, where we would expect it. But let's finish up with Breshit Rabbati, which will kind of bring us back to our hey, the angels aren't so great, so maybe have mercy on us theme. Okay, and I will translate as we go. Rav Yosef Amar, Ru'u HaMalachim, B'nei Elohim. It's actually a midrash on the verses in Genesis 6 and Breshit Vav. Breshit Rabbati, let me give you the years. Is 11th century, so this is pretty late. Okay. Rav Yosef Amar, Ru'u HaMalachim, Shaya Habaruch Hu Mitatsev al Shabara Bnei Adam. The angel saw that God was regretting that he made man. Miyad amdu shnei malachim lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, sheshmam Sham Chazai v'Azael. Okay. And so two angels stood before God, that their names were Sham Chazai, essentially Shemi Chaza, and Azael, right? So it's a very clear call back to what we read in Enoch. It's Shemi Chazai and Asael. Those are the guys, right? Shem Chazai and Azael. V'amru lefanav, Ribono shel olam. Halo amanu lefanacha b'sha'a shebarata olamcha al tivra adam. Said, we told you. You normally shouldn't say I told you so to God, but these angels didn't get the memo. They're like, hey, God, we told you when you created your world, don't make man. Don't do it. Kinyan shenemar ma'ushkitis. They're quoting Psalms because, of course, they know all the Torah. As it says, what is man that you should mention him? You should remember him. Amar lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, said to them, Va'olam matahelav, and the world, what's going to be on it? They say I think what they're saying is that we'll be the ones, right? Amar lahem galoi v'yadua lefanai ilu hayitem b'olama v'yetz hara shalet b'chem kishem sheshalat b'adam hayitem kashim mehem. Says he says to them, it's open and known to me. I know as God that if you were in their world and the evil inclination ruled you, right, the way it rules man, you would be even worse than them. Amrulo, tena reshut, v'nador ma'priot, v'ter'eh anu mekadshim shimcha. He said, give us permission and we'll live with the creations and you will see how we sanctify your name. These two angels say to him, Amar lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kvar natati lachem reshut. God says to them, hey, I already gave you permission. Go ahead. Miyad yardu v'shlit behem yetzer hara. So right away, they went down and God let the evil inclination rule them. Okay. Kevan shara'u b'not hadam shem yafot ta'u acharehen. As soon as they saw the daughters of man that are beautiful, they strayed after them. V'lo yachlu lichbosh b'yitzran. And they weren't able to conquer their inclination. Hadahu dichtiv v'yiru b'nei Elohim. That's as it's written, and the sons of God saw. Right? Ra'asham chazai riva achat sheshma astira atane navo. So Sham Chazai sees one specific girl named Astira, right? And he wants her. Amar la hashmi ili. He says, listen to me. Amar lo, eini shamat lecha ad shetilambeni shem hamefurash she'ata ole bo l'rakia b'sha'a she'ata zochro. She says, she's not an idiot. She knows this guy's got some powers. She says, I am not going to, give in to you until I'm not going to listen to you, which means kind of, go along with you, until you teach me the Shem HaMefurash, the divine name that you use to rise to the heaven when you mention it. Miyad lamda v'izkirato b'tal rakia. He immediately taught her, and she mentioned it and rose to the heavens. Right? She got away, right? And that's why, of course, her name is Astira, right? Sarah, right? So like stars, etc. Okay, so she rises right up as soon as she gets the name. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, ho'il uparsha atzma me'avera esena dugma shetizkar ba'olam. Right? God said, since she separated herself from sin, right? Because she didn't give in to this angel, because she separated herself out from sin, I'm going to make her an example that will be mentioned and remembered in the world. Miyad kava HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'zayin kochavim shel kima. Right? So he set her among the 7 stars of Kima. Is Kima Uxil, right? So Kima, someone remember? I will look it up. Oh, it's the Pleiades. Okay, so it's setting her in among the stars of the Pleiades. So that's her reward. Back to our text. So God set her among the stars of the Pleiades. Kevan shera'u kach. They saw this and they married women and they had children. Rav Omer v'kitalel datcha holy God etzal malachim shebnei Shebasar vadam, that flesh and blood can touch angels. V'hachtiv mishatav eish lohet. So Rav has the same problem that we saw earlier. If they're fire, how could they have any sort of relations with flesh and blood? Ela melamed kevan shenaflu malachim mimakom kedushatam min hashamayim shalat behem yetzer hara kibnei adam v'komatam nasa kibnei adam v'lafshuku shafar. And here it's being more explicit. The reason that when they came down, they clothed themselves in dirt, meaning they took a human body. Why? Because the evil inclination ruled them. So in other words, with an evil inclination came a human body. This is a decent quote for that from Eov. It makes more sense in this context. Amar Rav Tzadok, mehem noldu hanakim asher hochim bazadon libam mushalchim yedehim b'chol geza v'chamas u'shlichut damim shenemar v'sham re'inu et nefilhim. And that's so now similar to Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Rav Tzadok here says they had the giants. This is kind of parallel to Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, in fact, who steal and do violence and bloodshed. Tani sham chazai holid bet banim shmutam hai v'hei or hey v'hai v'nasu nashim v'lidu sichon v'og. So Sham Chazai has two sons who seem to have identical names, who marry women and have Sichon and Og. Rav Yosef Amar b'sha'ash nigzara gzeira levo mabul b'olam shagar hakadosh baruch hu lemetatron shliach l'Shem Chazai. Okay, here we have Metatron coming up. So when the decision was made to have a flood, God sent Metatron as a messenger to Shem Chazai, right? He said, God is going to destroy the world. And Shem Chazai raised his voice and cried and yelled and was sorry for the world and for his sons. And then it says, that each one of them would eat 1,000 camels and 1,000 horses and 1,000 of every type of animal, from anything that lived, right? So he can remind you who his sons are, right? And then they have dreams. Now the dreams, okay, so and then his giant sons, High and High, have dreams that essentially they see their deaths coming. Now this is actually very interesting because there is a text from Second Temple period, which actually we didn't look at, called the Book of the Giants. And the Book of the Giants has this. The giants have a dream and I believe they call on Enoch to interpret it. Or it's not clear they're discussing it. They're actually having a counselor discussing their dream where they foresee their demise, right? And this seems to be drawing from a text similar to that, right? They go to their father and they say, what does this mean? And he says, listen, God's going to bring a flood and he's going to destroy the world. And there's only one person who's going to, and he's only one person and his 3 sons are going to survive. Miyad saku b'chu v'amru achshav ma teheh aleinu u'b'ma yizkor shmenu amar lo al tachushu v'al titztaru sheshmotchem lo yachlu mitoch habriot la'olam. And they said, what is going to be, who's going to remember us, right? He says, don't worry, your names will never be away from the creatures of the world. Shekol zman shigaru v'istablu avanim v'etzim v'chol tzarchehem einam sofchim el al shmechem hai v'hai. He said, don't worry, your names are never going to be far from people, because whenever they're schlepping stones and wood and anything else they need, they're going to be calling out, hurry, hurry. So your names will never be forgotten. Okay, so kind of cute, right? Doesn't seem very it doesn't sound like something you're supposed to take particularly seriously. Amru alav al Shem Chazai shechazar b'tshuva v'tala asmo ben shamayim v'aretz rosho lemata v'raglav lemala lefisha lo hayalo pitchon pelef nekadosh baruch hu. And they say that Shem Chazai, I keep on saying Shem Chazai, of course it's Shem Chazai, which frankly was probably originally, right? Shem Chazai repents, and he suspends himself between heaven and earth with his head below and his legs and feet above, because he couldn't open his mouth before God. And until today, he is suspended in repentance between heaven and earth. In other words, he can't face God because he sinned, and therefore his feet are up and his face is down. Aval Azael lo chazar b'tshuva, but Azael never repented. V'hu memuneh al kol minei tziv'onim v'tachshitin shel nashim shemesitim bnei adam ledaber aveira v'adayin hu omed b'kokolo. And so he's responsible for all the makeup and jewelry of women that leads men astray, right? And he's still keeping on with his sin. Note the parallel to Enoch here, going back, that Azael is responsible for women making themselves up and beautifying themselves, which is Asael. It's something that Asael teaches them in Enoch, right? So you keep on seeing these little glimmers of things coming from these other works. ולקחה היו ישראל מקריבים קורבנות והיו נותנים גורל אחד להשם שיכפר על כל עוונות ישראל וגורל אחד לעזאזל שיסבול עוונותיהם של ישראל. So he says, so here, so remember, Shem Chazai has repented and is suspended between heaven and earth. It's an interesting interpretation of this idea that that there are souls of the angels or of the giants suspended between heaven and earth. Here, that soul is a repentant angel. It's not some kind of force for evil. It's a repentant angel who's suspended between heaven and earth in repentance, while Azael is still sinning by causing women to make themselves beautiful, make themselves put on makeup and wear jewelry. And for that reason, you have Azazel. For that reason, you have the goat Azazel. It's going to bear the sins of Israel because of the sins of Azael, the second of these angels. Okay. So a quick, so let's talk a little bit about what we saw in this story. Besides the cute little thing about the giant sons who are dead and they're like, oh no, we're gonna die. He's like, don't worry, people will always remember your name, right? That's, you know, but the underlying idea is that you had two angels who said, no problem, we can handle the evil inclination, and they couldn't. They could not by far, right? One of them repents, the other one doesn't. The repentant one, however, his kids do die, right? His kids are going to be wiped out in the flood. And it's very sad, but that's what's going to happen because they are consuming thousands of beasts and they're not supposed to be there, right? So at the same time, it changes a lot of what we saw in some other accounts, again, where if we were looking at like Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, the idea of, oh, suspended between heaven and earth, and you could kind of say, oh, are these evil spirits? Here, there's none of that. And there's the emphasis is on the evil inclination, right? There's an evil inclination. The evil inclination is something that's very hard to resist. And as soon as the angels were going to come on earth, part of being among humanity meant being put under the control, under the influence of the evil inclination, where what causes sin is the evil inclination, and it's very, very hard to resist. And we humans are better at it than angels are. It's just that they don't have it, right? And in fact, the young woman that Shemi Chaza tries to seduce, she is both virtuous and clever and gets to be a star, right? What it may be implied there is that what's going on with Shem Chazai and Azael were like, hey, we're among women, let's see how many we can get. After Shemi, because it says after they see that this young woman has been put among the stars, they then marry and have children. And it's possible that the implication is that they learned, well, settle down. Like, this is not what you were doing. That is no good, guys. You got to pick one and settle down with her. But even so, this was not right? This was in the end not right because they're angels and they have these giant children. And in the final analysis, they have to go. So that is, and again, we saw that kind of, and again, I'll have to bring the Book of the Giants. It's very, very fragmentary, which is why it's kind of frustrating to read, but I'll bring it so we can look at it, where it seems that these giants are having dreams of their impending demise and need to figure out what it means. And that's also being reflected in this very late Midrash. So it's interesting how these works and traditions kind of filter through, and they become very different once we have the aim of different rabbinic texts, where the aim is absolutely not, in general, to blame sin on these demonic influences. On the contrary, we already know it comes from the evil inclination, right? This is something that at this point, everyone's like, yep, it's the evil inclination. And the evil inclination can be described as demonic, or it can be described as a human inclination, but it's something that everyone kind of agrees on, that's where sin comes from. That's where the sin is. And so if angels are sinning, it just shows just how strong this thing is. And that frankly, and again, this idea of humans must be better than angels because we got the Torah. So how are we better than angels? Well, look at this. Look at this prime example, right? So, and so we can see how, again, how the same verses in Bereshit and very similar ideas can really be used for very different purposes. And are you really, frankly, in terms of ideas, in terms of ideology, you would not be able to connect. It's very different to say, hey, these angels sinning shows how much better people are at this. Is very different than the message of Enoch or anyone probably in the Second Temple period would have used. They never would have said, hey, humans are better than angels, right? Whereas that's a very common trope in rabbinic literature, that in a certain sense, at least, humans are better than angels, right? Because we have to deal with this evil inclination and they have no clue. Okay. Any questions?
I'm wondering when we look at the Midrashic story, it seems because of the names that there is some kind of direct or almost direct connection to the Enochic literature. But I'm wondering, is the whole story based in some form or another on Enoch, or were parts of it just coincidentally developed in parallel?
So I think when we have things like the giants having dreams, I think in the last version that we read, it's hard not to see that, and where Shem Chazai comes up from nowhere, right? All of a sudden you have Shem Chazai. It's very hard not to see the connection to Enoch and probably the Book of the Giants. Okay, so there you really see that kind of connection. It's not coming spontaneously from Torah texts. In other places, it's not that hard to actually say, hey, all of this is in Torah text, because you have, or the basics, right? Because what do you have in the Torah, right? You have Bnei Elohim Uvnot Adam, right? The divine beings being with human women. You have the Nephilim that are later in Bamidbar in Numbers connected to giants. So you've got that connection. You've got the connection that the giants are their kids. You've got these angels mating with human women. You have the flood following, right? So those elements, right? So in other words, so to create a story saying, hey, and we have Azazel, right? So to create a story saying, hey, there's Azza and Azazel, or whatever, Azazel, or whatever you want to say, Azza and Azael, and these two angels decided to go down and mate with human women. You could come up with that story very easily without any of this Enoch stuff, right? But then when you have these certain parallels where, so for example, in the last case, really where we have Azael specifically teaching women about makeup, or we have, the idea that, oh, they're caught between heaven and earth, right? There are certain elements you say, well, these maybe are coming. In this last example, it's very, very clear, right? All of a sudden we have Shem Chazai. Why in the world we have Shem Chazai? Where's this name coming from? It's got to be somehow connected to the Enochic literature, right? Not necessarily directly. It could be through some other flow, folkloric flow, but it's clearly drawing from that, right? But a lot of these things, kind of the basics of, hey, you've got these two angels, they say we can be better than humans. God's like, haha, try it. You go down, like that's very easy to kind of build on top of the verses that we have. So again, the last example is the clearest one, right? Where we see a very, it's quite obvious that that it's drawing from some kind of Enochic tradition. Whether they're in between. If you would like, we can look back at it, and I'll show you what I mean. But I think it's pretty clear. And again, the use of the name Shem Chazai is a dead giveaway, because it's not anywhere it's not in Azazel. There's nowhere for it to come from that you would use it in this context, except we've seen it in Enoch.
And once again, you said that Reshit Rabbati is 9th, 10th century?
It's late. What we looked at was 11th century.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Breshit Rabbati is 11th century. So it could absolutely have all sorts of but if we look at, let me take a quick look again at Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. With Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, you could also get, honestly, you could get to Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer just with the verses. The Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, because also there's a big emphasis in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer about how the sinning women are specifically descended from Cain. So it's a much more kind of, you could absolutely get there from the biblical verses. So sometimes the question is, okay, but why would you want to? Right? In Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, there's less of a reason to go into this story at length, and it really does do it at length. The question is, okay, why is this story important? Why are you going into this so much? Is it because this story has taken on a kind of a power of its own? Whereas where everything else that we read, besides our last source, besides Breshit Rabbati, were these small, short little stories, like small, short little references. Right? Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer really goes into it. And the question is, why is this an important story? There you might say, okay, it's because the Watcher story has a kind of a greater force. So thank you for joining me. And I will see you next week.